Hi guys. Before we begin, I just need to let you know that you're going to have to use the additional sheets of paper that you've been provided with by me before the lesson, but you're also going to have to take notes throughout the course of this presentation because obviously your booklets are with me in the classroom. So just to kind of like get to grips with it before we start, you need to get used to pausing me where I tell you to and complete different activities and also making notes, because as we've seen with the other models of addictive behaviour, there's a lot of key terminology to kind of get used to. So make sure that you are prepared, and I'll give you a few seconds to do that now. So if you just pause me and then make sure that you've got all your stuff out, okay? Okay, so now that we're all ready, obviously just a bit of background on the cognitive model of addictive behaviour. You've all studied cognitive psychology before, and you know that the underlying principle beneath all abnormal behaviour, including addiction, is that there's some sort of irrational process going on. So this particular topic is no different to anything that we've ever studied at abnormality. It is all to do with irrational processes. Okay, so we're going to move through this particular model of addictive behaviour in exactly the same way as what we've done the others. So we're going to begin with the process of initiation, i.e. where does the addiction come from in the first place? So according to this approach, remember the cognitive approach, all addictions occur as a result of something known as self-medication, which is an overwhelming desire to alleviate what we refer to as a negative mental state. Now that negative mental state can be anything, okay? So what I would like you to do for me now is I would like you to have a about what kind of negative mental state would cause someone to begin a smoking addiction, and then possibly what kinds of negative mental states might result in gambling. So if you've got any experience of either of those two addictions, you could maybe build on your own past experiences, or just generally speaking, what moods or what kind of states of mind do you think would cause someone to begin a smoking addiction or a gambling addiction? So if you just make some notes now, just generally pop some ideas down and then we'll move on. Okay, so hopefully that should have been enough time for you to just have a think about that and to make some notes. So we'll now go through the kind of textbook definition of mental states are. So according to cognitive theories of addiction, the negative mental states which result in a desire to begin a smoking addiction often include boredom. So often teenagers are just bored and don't really have any other outlet. In older adults, it tends to be a combination of possible stress, and again, it's a bit of an outlet, and maybe some sort of frustration. So to give you a bit of personal experience, you all know that I'm a smoker, and I tend to smoke more when I'm a little bit stressed out. The theory is that that could cause the initiation of smoking, even in somebody who's never had a cigarette before. That you're a bit stressed out, it's a negative mental state, and you think that by smoking it will make you feel better. When considering gambling, boredom is a factor, but the two that are more regularly mentioned are depression and low mood. Now, whether or not that correlates with possible debt problems, there's a lot of research in that area, but we will come back to this idea that it's possible cycle. So somebody is in debt initially, that makes them feel depressed, that makes them feel in a low mood, and that causes the gambling addiction to begin. Again, if you want to just pause me for a second and maybe pop some notes down, and for the next section you're going to need the sheet in front of you, which is a little purple grid. It's got a boatload of statements on it, so if you can just get yourself sorted with that. Right, so we've already mentioned the idea of alleviating negative mental states. I'm going to take that one step further now, and this is specific to gambling, but as you're going to see towards the end, we can also use it for smoking as well. Now, this is an idea put forward by somebody called Aaron Beck, which is a famous cognitive psychologist, and he argues that the initiation of addictive behaviour is just all part of a vicious circle. In other words, you become trapped in a cycle which can kind of exacerbate create addictive behaviour. So you need to get the purple sheets in front of you. What you need to try and do for me is number the statements 1 to 5 to create a vicious circle. So pause me for a second now and have a go at doing that for me. Okay, so if we look at these statements carefully, you'll see that the cycle obviously begins when the individual is in a low mood, okay? So they maybe are in kind of like financial problems often, so that obviously causes them to worry, makes them feel a bit depressed, and they see gambling as a way out of that situation. But what they don't tend to consider is that gambling will obviously result in more debt in most cases, the nature of the addiction, and that will just make the situation infinitely worse. So if we just have a look at the order statements are supposed to go in. So the individual starts to gamble to relieve whatever financial problems they're already experiencing, which then causes low mood. They then find themselves in greater debt because they've already gambled away whatever they had. That worsens the situation and makes them feel even lower. The individual then gambles more to relieve the low mood and the debt that they've already incurred, and what we end up with is an addiction, a cycle that they are totally and utterly trapped in. So that is this idea of Beck's vicious circle or vicious cycle, however you want to say it. Just another way to illustrate that, if you want to jot this into your notes, and if you wanted to use this diagram in the exam, that's absolutely fine as well. It's just more of a process. So you would describe it in a paragraph form with the statements that you've just seen. This is just a way for you to remember it. So low mood and debt problems, they gamble to relieve the debt, that creates more debt, they gamble more to relieve the stress. Okay? You just want to pause me a sec whilst you copy that down. The next little section of initiation that we're going to have a look at is a new idea. It's something called cognitive myopia. Now, I'm betting that some of you actually suffer with myopia yourselves. Some of you, it will be a term that you're familiar with. It is basically the idea of short-sightedness. Now, we use it with the word cognitive in front of it. So it is cognitive short-sightedness, i.e. not thinking far enough into the future. So if you'd like to find the sheet for me now with the little eyeball on, and then we'll move on to the next section. So as I've just said, the idea of cognitive myopia is short-sightedness. So what I would like you to try and do for me, to try and fill in those few blanks now using the word bank. How could we apply the idea of short-sightedness to the initiation of gambling? So just pause me for a second and just get those words filled in, please. Right, so that should have been enough time for you to have a quick think about the idea of cognitive myopia. So if you just want to check your answers against what I've put on the screen now. So the way that we use cognitive myopia to explain initiation of a gambling addiction is that gamblers only tend to focus on the immediate effects, all right? So the immediate gratifying state of the buzz that comes out of winning, so excitement and elevated mood. And what they fail to see is the long-term consequences. So the long-term consequences of a heavy gambling addiction are possible financial worries. Obviously that comes to most gamblers at some point, but then more importantly, any kind of like social and family problems. So often they have to sacrifice relationships because they've got themselves into such debt. So that is what we call a bias way of thinking. If you want to put a term on it, it's kind of like a rose-tinted way of thinking about behaviour. So I will win on my next gamble rather than thinking I'm going to lose £100,000 somewhere down the line. So it's a biased way of thinking, and it creates the gambling addiction through what we would just simply call faulty decision making. But remember, this is all still to do with initiation at the moment. Now, we've finished with the initiation of gambling for the moment. You're going to get a chance to kind of fill in a summary sheet in a little while, but we also need to consider the initiation of smoking. So we said that it might be a result of a desire to self-medicate and alleviate a negative mental state. But what we find with most smokers is that their perception of smoking initially is a biased way of looking at the behaviour. So I've put in front of you several images which kind of conjure up a positive image of smoking. So for somebody such as myself, who started smoking at a very young age, these are the kind of images that I associated with smoking in my head. So obviously for me, my personal perception of smoking was that it was cool and I was going to look good in front of all of my friends. However, because obviously smoking is becoming less and less, these are the kinds of perceptions that most people will have of smoking nowadays. So you can see the lady on the left with the yellow fingers and the yellow teeth, the wrinkles, the bags under the eyes, and then obviously you've got all of the advertisements which give a very, very negative perception of smoking. They're likely to not smoke. They won't initiate an addiction because their perception of smoking is different to mine. It's a very negative perception. And we do differ, okay? Even though there's all sorts of marketing products out there, still teenagers and adults have very different perceptions of what smoking entails. For some people, it still does attract that kind of cool vibe. Now this is called theory of planned behaviour. And it can be used alongside Beck's vicious cycle to explain the initiation of smoking, whereby if you've got a positive perception of a particular behaviour, then you're more likely to engage in it because you don't see any problems with it. Whereas if you've got a negative perception, then you'll decline that behaviour. So it is just literally about perceptions, theory of planned behaviour, and we will be coming back to that idea. Right, now once we've got to the end of the initiation portion, what I'd like you to do for me is to have a go at completing the summary sheet. Try to do it without looking back at your notes, but obviously if you do need it, there's a lot of terminology. Just take a few moments now to summarise it and condense it down. Okay, if you just pause me there and then come back to me once you've finished. Right, so now we've got initiation out of the way, we obviously need to move into maintenance. So why is the addiction sustained? And as you can see on the screen, according to the cognitive approach, it is all down to, again, this idea of irrational thinking. So what we're going to do now, in the next few minutes, is see whether or not you have got the type of irrational thought processes that might make you susceptible to becoming a gambler, okay? So if you the scenario, I want you to imagine that you were playing on a roulette wheel and you've landed 4 different spins. So every time it's landed in the last 4 turns, it's landed on red. Now, you're in a situation where you're about to make a bet for the 5th time. I want you to tell me whether or not you would keep your bet on red, right, and bet red for the 5th time in a run maybe, or whether or not you would be tempted to change your mind to black. So you've got a little slip in front of you. I just want you to make your bet, okay? Pause me now, make a bet. Just go with your gut reaction. Okay, so if you changed your answer to black, then you are unfortunately more likely to develop at some point the gambling addiction. And if you were to develop it, then it will likely to be maintained as well. Because if you change your answer to black, then you have probably got a very poor understanding of probability. And what you've demonstrated is something known as gambler's fallacy. So you can see the description of what the gambler's fallacy is in the quotation marks at the bottom of the screen. It is the mistaken belief that the odds of something with a fixed probability change depending on recent events. So I set up a scenario for you where I'd said the last 4 rolls of the ball had all landed on red. The odds of it landing on red the next time are exactly the same as what it has been for the previous 4 outcomes. So by changing your mind to black, you think that there's an increased likelihood of it landing on black the next time. In fact, the odds will remain exactly the same every single time. And if you know anybody with a gambling addiction, this is kind of their mentality, the gambler's fallacy. They argue that what has happened beforehand has an impact on the outcome of the next bet. So if they've lost 5 times, they're definitely going to win the next time. Okay, it's this, again, this biased way of thinking. So this can be used to explain why we would maintain the addiction of gambling. What we can also use to explain the maintenance of gambling is a series of irrational cognitive biases. So what you're going to need for the next part of the session is the little sheet of paper in front of you that's got a blue table on there. I believe it's got 4 different sections. So if you can find that from your notes now, pause me for a second and get that out in front of you. Okay, so hopefully you've got in front of you now the same information as what I've got on the screen. So these are 4 different irrational cognitive biases which could increase the likelihood of maintaining a gambling addiction. So to give them their descriptions, and we'll work on the terms in a moment. Firstly, we've got the belief that we can control random events. For example, we are able to choose the winning lottery numbers, or we're able to choose, the outcome of a football match. Next one down, wins in the mind of a gambler are attributed to the gambler's skill. So if they do win, all right, if they kind of like place a bet correctly, or if they're on poker table or something, if they win, it's because they are good at what they've done. Yet losses are often attributed or misattributed to external factors. So when it's going good, it's because they're good. When it's going bad, it's because of bad luck. The next one down, this idea that they will only remember the wins in their head. So we only kind of like keep in mind the positive impact or the positive outcomes of gambling. A gambler is not going to recall the last time they lost £500. All they'll remember is the last time they won £1,000. So remembering more wins than what they would remember losses obviously encourages them to keep going. And then the last description is superstitious belief that 2 things are causally connected. Notice that says causally, not casually. So causally connected when they are not. For example, blowing on dice will bring you the outcome that you desire, all right? Having a lucky charm of some sort will bring you good luck. So it's this idea that 2 things which are totally unconnected or totally random are causally linked, that one thing can have an effect on the other. So we've got the descriptions of the irrational cognitive biases, and now what's in front of you is the 4 terms. So I'd like you to all have a go, pause me with this on the screen, have a go at matching up the correct name, so I'm not telling you anything else about it, the correct name to what you believe is the correct description, so which is the correct cognitive bias. So hopefully that should have been enough time for you to have a go at doing that. Now, I want you to get them correct, obviously, so I've given you the right answers. So the illusion of control is that description where we believe that we control random events such as winning lottery numbers and picking those out ourselves. The illusory correlations is this idea that 2 things are causally connected when they're not. The flexible attribution is this idea that you're flexible in kind of like how you view the outcomes of your gambling addiction. So your winning is your skill, your losing is your bad luck. So the attributions are what you're assigning. So the skill is what you've assigned to you, the bad luck is what you've assigned elsewhere. So you're being flexible in how you're viewing it. And then the availability bias is to do with memory. So you recall more wins than what you do losses. The wins are available to you, whereas the losses are not. So they are all of the irrational cognitive biases that we tend to see in people with a heavy gambling addiction. If those biases are present, then that therefore means the individual is more likely to continue gambling because there is something wrong with their thought processes. Not only are they demonstrating the gambling fallacy or the gambler's fallacy, they're also often demonstrating one, if not all, of these irrational cognitive biases. Now, whilst for gambling, there's a lot of terminology and lots of new words to get your head round, for smoking and the maintenance of smoking, it's a very easy addiction to explain. So looking at the images presented on the screen right now, why might a smoker believe that they need to continue smoking? I mean, somebody who is heavily addicted, I know quite a lot of people who are, heavily addicted to nicotine, and it kind of clouds their judgment. They genuinely believe that they can't do anything else in a morning without having a cigarette. So, do you know anybody who's that badly addicted that the first thing that they think about as soon as they wake up is having their first cig? Cup of tea or a cup of coffee as well as a cig, and then they're good to go. So that's what they tend to believe, all right, that they have to keep smoking. So if you get the next sheet out in front of you, which is the purple paragraph, which has got the words blanked out on it, which on the screen now, I'd just like you to have a think about what would go in those blanks. So we've just said that for maintenance of smoking, it may be this idea that they feel they have got to continue. So just pause me now and have a go at filling that in for me. Right, so that should have been enough time for you to have a go over that. Now against what's on the screen. So for smokers, it's a biased belief or the wrongful belief that smoking actually enhances their performance. So they actually feel that they are less capable of completing tasks without a cigarette, and that's why I was saying for smokers who are genuinely addicted to nicotine, they believe that they cannot carry out routine daily tasks without having a cigarette. So they use smoking, as you can see there, as a coping mechanism to improve their concentration levels, but that's not actually what's going on. All that's going on in the smoker's head is that they believe that smoking has a positive effect on them. It doesn't help concentration, but they believe it to do that. So they think that on a morning they have to have a cigarette, okay? So that belief that smoking has a positive effect on their behaviour contributes to the maintenance of the addiction. Now, because their behaviour becomes habitual over time, they ultimately then start to lack control over their addiction, and the spiral. So it is this telling themselves that they cannot do anything without a cigarette. So we just keep going and going and upping the dosage as we go. Now at that point, we come to the end of the maintenance section. So again, if you get your summary sheets back out in front of you and now try to fill in all the maintenance section using all the right terminology and obviously apply it to both smoking and gambling. So again, pause the presentation and just spend a few minutes doing that for me, please. So lastly, we need to explain the cognitive principles behind relapse of any addiction. And the major term for you to learn in this section is self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is, to put it in its correct phrase, is the belief in one's capability to achieve a desired goal or outcome, i.e. telling yourself that you are able to do something will mean that you are able to do something. Telling yourself before you even start that you're not able, then that is low self-efficacy, and according to the cognitive model of addiction, that encourages relapse. People with addictions convince themselves before they even try to abstain that they're not going to be able to. So you can see this next screen just kind of like summarizes that, what I've just said there. So low self-efficacy limits any attempt to abstain from, in this case, gambling. The individual questions their own capabilities. They don't think that they're going to be successful at quitting. Therefore, if they've already told themselves that they're going to be unsuccessful, then they're less likely to make what we would call an extended effort. So they're just telling themselves, well, I am going to relapse at some point in time, and therefore they don't really try as hard. So relapse in itself, what we call, validates their low self-efficacy. It tells them that they were right in the first place, which creates what is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's almost, in a nutshell, this idea that, well, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it, so therefore I'm going to try less to be able to quit, and when I do relapse, it was just proving the point. So if you want to just copy this down, this is the self-fulfilling prophecy in a cyclical notion. So somebody who has got low self-efficacy, who is trying to abstain from gambling, they will tell themselves, I won't be able to quit. And that's their judgment before they even try to abstain. If they do try to abstain, then the thought that's going to be constantly in their head is, I'm only going to relapse at some point. And then when they do eventually relapse, because they've convinced themselves that they're not able to quit, then they just tell themselves, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. So it's that last stage, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. And once that loop has been completed once, the individual is just trapped in a cycle. So they may try to abstain on a number of occasions, but they will always relapse. So that's based on this idea of low self-efficacy to begin with, telling yourself you're not going to be able to do something, which then makes you try less hard to actually abstain. And then once you do eventually relapse, we've got self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell yourself you weren't going to be able to do it, and you didn't do it. So you're just going to keep going round in a loop. Okay, so you can just see that on the screen if you want to use that terminology, or if you want to explain it in the way that I've just done there. Either way is totally fine. So for the relapse of smoking, we could use self-efficacy, self-fulfilling prophecy, but there's a slightly different idea that comes into play when trying to explain why somebody who abstains from smoking would eventually relapse. Now on the screen in front of you are a range of feelings or sensations that a smoker may well experience if they do try to abstain from nicotine. So they might start to feel nauseous. They might start to feel like they're not able to concentrate. They'll feel ratty, they'll feel angry, they'll feel irritable. So they'll start to feel a bit more emotional. They might also feel that they're quite hungry, and that's just a few, okay? So there are lots and lots of other sensations that may well go with abstaining from nicotine. What is actually going on in the head of a smoker is an attribution error. So yes, they may be having problems in concentrating. Yes, they might feel overly hungry, but that is not necessarily to do with the result of withdrawing from the nicotine. What is going on is purely coincidental in a lot of instances, but the smoker makes an attribution error, okay, or misattribution. They wrongly blame those negative thoughts and feelings on the lack of nicotine. So there may be other reasons why they're not able to concentrate, or there may be other reasons why they feel nauseous. It is nothing to do with abstaining from the cigarettes in most cases. But in their head, somebody who has been addicted to this substance for a very long time, they blame it on the withdrawal process. Now, obviously, if they think that therefore in smoking it will take away those undesirable sensations, that's when we eventually get relapse. So you can see on this slide, we refer to these false outcome expectations. They actually believe that smoking helps them to relax. They believe that by having a cigarette, okay, and stopping or refraining from abstaining and engaging with the addiction again, that it will make them feel less stressed. It will make them feel less nauseous. It will make them feel less emotional. So they have these attribution errors, okay, they misattribute all these horrible, nasty effects to the fact that they're withdrawing from smoking, and they give themselves false expectations. By wrongly believing that it does help them to concentrate, they therefore are more likely to relapse eventually. Now, I said a few moments ago that we can use the idea of low self-efficacy and self-fulfilling prophecy to apply over to smoking as well as gambling. So if you want to just get this sheet in front of you now and using the exact same set of ideas that we talked about for gambling, if you want to rewind it, you can do. Just give me in a paragraph, please, how self-efficacy could also explain this addiction relapse. Okay, so pause this now and try and have a go at that. Right, so we've reached the end of the cognitive model. I am aware that there's a lot of terminology for you to digest, but if you want to go back now and complete all of your summary sheet, including the relapse section, and you need to make sure that you've applied it well to both smoking and gambling. And you're going to need that in front of you in order to be next task, which is a bit of evaluation. So pause this for the moment, get that all filled in, and then come back to this. Okay, so we're not going to complete the full evaluation for the cognitive model. All I'm going to go through with you is the evidence that has been provided. So the first study that we've got is evidence to show that cognitive biases may play a role in addictive behaviour, specifically in this case, gambling. So the Griffith study was a content analysis. Content analysis is converting qualitative data into quantitative data by using coding sheets. So it was a content analysis of verbalizations made at a fruit machine. And you can see on the screen, those verbalizations just involve monitoring any speech that was made whilst playing on the fruit machine. So they were monitoring 29 males and 1 female, and they were divided into regular and non-regular gamblers. So the regular gamblers were more likely, according to Griffiths, to make what he deemed to be irrational verbalizations. So they were actually talking to the fruit machine. And you can see in the bottom section of the slide, I've given you 3 examples of such irrational verbalizations. So things like, come on, be good to me, or come on, show me the money this time, etc., etc. So content analysis of verbalizations, and the regular gamblers, okay, the people who we suspect are addicted to gambling, made lots and lots of irrational verbalizations. Now, purposes of the exam, you obviously need to refer back to your terminology from your AO1. So which example of a cognitive bias do you think that would be? So they're making such phrases towards the fruit machine as, come on, be good to me, etc., etc. So in their head, why are they talking to the fruit machine? Which of our 4 cognitive biases would that be classed as? What do they believe is happening by talking to that fruit machine? So have a think about that. I'm just going to pre-warn you, I'm not giving you the right answer. So this is something that you have to think about yourself, and I'll check you when you come into class. What you also need to do in a second, if you pause me, is you need to try and write a conclusion. So once you've decided on the cognitive bias, you all know by this point that a good conclusion talks about validity or reliability, and it loops back up to something from your AO1. So if everybody can try and write a conclusion for me now, pause this, and then we'll move on to the next study. The second piece of research that we have is obviously to do with smoking, because we need 1 piece of research per addiction. So the second study from Connor is to do with the attitudes and behavioural intentions of some adolescent participants. So they studied nearly 1,000 adolescents between the age of 11 and 12 years old, and they went to speak to these children on 2 separate occasions. So the study was longitudinal in its nature. It lasted 9 months in total. So the 965 adolescents that were identified initially at that point in time were non-smokers. Connor then returned to them 9 months later, and he wanted to see whether or not any of them had taken up the habit of smoking. Now, what he found was that those children who had started smoking 9 months later were more likely to have had positive attitudes about smoking in the first part of the study. So the first part of the study involved questionnaires and interviews about their opinions of smoking. So as it suggests, took up smoking, were more likely to have positive opinions about smoking. Now, this links in to what we'd said in RAO1 about the theory of planned behaviour, where your behavioural intentions affect the outcome. So those children believed smoking to be a positive behaviour, maybe gives them popularity, makes them look cool, etc., etc., and that therefore increases their likelihood of developing that addiction, becoming initiated. So what I would like you to do is take those bits of terminology on board and try now to give me a good conclusion. Okay, so pause that there. Obviously, the last thing for us to contend with, and you're going to be pretty annoyed with seeing Mark at this point in time, but we're going to have a go at this practical question again. So we've looked at Mark on a number of different occasions. We looked at him initially for biological model, then again for the behavioural model. We're now going to look at him again now that we've finished all 3 of the models, and you have got enough to go on now to be able to get the full 10 marks. I haven't given you enough up to this point. So now you need to get your summary sheets out on the biological model, the behavioural model, and what you've just filled in on the cognitive model. And I would like you now to try and pick up the full 10 marks. How could you talk about all 3 of the models? How could you bring in research evidence to back up what you're saying? Really stretch yourself, pull out every single last mark, make good application to the stimulus. You know what the key areas are. This is going to be taken off you when you come into class at the beginning of next week, and what will be in front of you to check that you have gone through this cognitive model is another stimulus question, and I'm going to be checking whether or not you're using all the right terminology. So obviously do this question now, but spend a little bit of time going back over your notes, etc., etc. And I hope that this has been useful. We'll see whether or not you're able to tell me all the right ideas next week. Okay.